Nobody told you where this village was. That was the point. The path that led to it existed only in the knowledge of the people who needed to use it. A sequence of landmarks, turns, and terrain features that outsiders walked past without recognizing as directions. A particular rock formation at the fork of a frozen stream. A blaze mark on a birch tree that looked like a natural wound in the bark until you knew to look for it. The angle at which a ridge dropped into a valley that told you to turn before you could see the settlement itself. The Norse relationship with concealment was not paranoia. It was the rational response of people who had learned, through generations of experience, that visibility was a liability in a world where raiders moved fast and early. Warning determined whether your family ate through winter or did not survive to see spring. The village, when it came into view from the final approach, was not what most people conditioned by popular depictions of the Viking Age would expect. There were no horned helmets on poles. There was no dramatic palisade of sharpened stakes ringing a ring of dramatic longhouses. What there was instead was something more interesting and, in its own way, more impressive. A settlement that had grown organically into its landscape over generations, its structures positioned to take advantage of the terrain for shelter, drainage, and defensibility in ways that required intimate knowledge of the specific site, rather than the application of a generic fortification template. The longhouses were oriented to catch the prevailing wind on their gabled ends rather than their long walls, reducing heat loss in winter in ways that required someone to have paid careful attention to which direction the worst weather consistently came from. The storage structures were positioned on a slight rise that kept them above the frost line and above the drainage patterns of heavy rain. The animal shelters were adjacent to the main longhouse in a configuration that allowed their body heat to contribute to the warming of the human living space through shared walls. A passive heating strategy that required no technology beyond the observation that animals generate warmth. This is the kind of detail that gets lost when we talk about the Viking Age at the level of raids and battles and long ship voyages. The daily engineering of survival in a cold northern climate was as demanding an intellectual challenge as any military campaign, and the people who got it right left behind settlements that worked, that kept people alive through conditions that would kill most modern adults within days if they were stripped of their contemporary infrastructure and placed in the same environment without preparation. The hidden village was not just a place to sleep. It was a technology for staying alive, built from wood and stone and turf, and the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had lived in it before. What city or state are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. We genuinely love seeing where people find this kind of content. Someone's always watching from somewhere unexpected, and it keeps us motivated to know who's on the other end of this. The structure of the day in a Norse village of this kind was determined not by clocks, there were none, but by light, by temperature, by the demands of the season, and by the rhythm of tasks that could not be deferred without consequence. In the depths of winter at northern latitudes, usable daylight might be as few as 6 hours, and those hours were not evenly distributed across the sky. The sun barely cleared the horizon, producing a long, slanted light that was beautiful and completely inadequate for fine work. The Norse adapted their task schedule to this reality with a practicality that modern work culture has largely abandoned. Coarse, physical outdoor work, wood-splitting, animal tending, water hauling from the stream that still ran beneath the ice, was done in whatever daylight existed. Fine craft work, textile production, tool repair, carving, the preparation of food that required attention to detail, moved indoors and was organized around firelight and the social space of the longhouse interior. The transition was not experienced as a deprivation, but as a natural shift in the character of the day. The same way the shift from summer to winter was experienced not as loss, but as the arrival of a different season with its own specific demands and, importantly, its own specific pleasures. The longhouse interior in winter was a sensory environment of remarkable complexity. The central hearth, a long stone-lined fire trench, rather than the compact fireplace familiar from later European domestic architecture, produced heat that radiated in all directions from a distributed source, warming the space more evenly than a single-point fireplace, and also allowing multiple cooking operations to proceed simultaneously at different positions along its length. The smoke from this fire had no chimney in the standard sense. It rose through the living space, depositing its chemical compounds on everything it passed: the hanging preserved foods, the timber structure overhead, the people living and working in the space, before escaping through adjustable vents in the roof peak. The air inside was not what we would consider clean. It was layered with smoke, with the smell of damp wool drying near the fire, with the particular animal smell of tallow lamps and the lanolin in the unwashed fleece that women were spinning into thread along the walls. And yet the Norse longhouse interior in winter was also the social center of everything that mattered. It was where stories were told, and knowledge was transmitted, and disputes were resolved, and decisions that affected the community were reached through the process of extended conversation that Norse culture valued highly. The cooking that happened over and beside that hearth was not simple. It was the application of considerable technical knowledge to the constraints of a specific set of ingredients and tools, producing results that were nutritionally complete and, by the accounts preserved in the sagas and in the archaeological record, genuinely varied and satisfying rather than monotonously repetitive. The staple was porridge, a word that in modern usage has connotations of blandness that are completely inappropriate to the Norse version. The grain base varied by what was available and what had been traded for. Barley was the most widely cultivated in Scandinavian conditions, rye in some regions, oats in others. But the preparation varied enormously. Grain could be dry roasted before cooking, which changed both the flavor profile, producing nuttier, more complex notes, and the cooking behavior, as pre-roasted grain absorbed water differently and produced a different texture in the finished porridge. The liquid used for cooking might be water, might be whey left over from cheese-making, might be a broth made from bones and scraps. Additions to the basic porridge ranged from dried berries and preserved fruit in their seasons, to rendered fat, to salted fish broken into pieces and stirred in, to dried herbs gathered from the forest and fields in summer and stored through the winter specifically for this purpose. The bread baked on flat stones beside the fire, flatbread, since the Norse did not have the infrastructure for leavened bread in most circumstances, though fermented grain porridge that had developed some leavening action from wild yeasts was not unknown, was a daily production that required attention and consistency. Getting the stone temperature right for flatbread required knowledge that couldn't be measured with instruments. You pressed your hand near the surface and read the heat with a sensitivity developed over years of practice. Adjusting the fire, moving the stone, positioning the dough disc with the confidence of someone who had done it hundreds of times and knew exactly what the surface should feel and look like when conditions were correct. The finished flatbread was dense and slightly smoky from the hearthstone, with a texture and flavor completely unlike modern bread, and it was eaten the moment it came off the stone because Norse flatbread was best fresh and became tough and difficult when it cooled and dried out. Meat preparation during winter relied heavily on what had been preserved since the autumn slaughter, but the cooking of preserved meat was not simply the rehydration of a dried or salted product and its consumption in the simplest possible form. Preserved meat was the starting point for cooking that used the full technical repertoire available. Long, slow simmering in large clay or iron vessels over the low end of the hearth fire, producing broths that extracted gelatin and fat and flavor from bones and tougher cuts in ways that made them both more digestible and more satisfying. The rendering of fat from fatty cuts to produce cooking medium and the preservation medium of lard, the use of bones cracked with a stone mallet to expose the marrow, as both a cooking flavoring and a direct food source, since bone marrow is calorically dense and rich in fat-soluble nutrients that might otherwise be difficult to obtain in winter. Nothing from the autumn slaughter was wasted. The concept of food waste, as we practice it in the modern world, would have been genuinely incomprehensible, not merely frowned upon, but literally impossible to understand from within a framework where the total food supply for the winter was fixed and known, and every calorie had been earned through labor. If you've been watching for a while, what's pulling you through this video? Is it the history angle, the survival element, the cooking and daily life stuff? Drop your honest answer in the comments. We find those responses genuinely useful when we're deciding what to cover next. The women of the hidden village occupied a social position that Norse culture defined with more formal legal acknowledgement than most contemporary medieval European societies were prepared to grant. A Norse free woman had the right to own property, to conduct commercial transactions, to divorce her husband under specified circumstances, and to manage the household economy, which was understood not as a subordinate domestic domain, but as a sphere of genuine authority over resources that determined whether the family survived. The keys to the household storage were literally hers. A large iron keyring was a symbol of the mistress of a Norse household, in the same way that a sword was a symbol of the male household head, and its significance was not decorative. She controlled access to the food supply, the preserved goods, the trade stores, and the household valuables. Decisions about when to open a barrel of salted fish, when to allow access to the grain store, when to trade preserved butter for other necessities. These were her decisions, made with the same kind of strategic thinking that a military commander applies to resource allocation in a campaign. The parallel is not accidental. The Norse household in winter was, in resource management terms, a siege operation, and the woman who managed it was running the logistics. The textile work that consumed enormous portions of women's time in winter, spinning wool into thread on drop spindles, weaving thread into cloth on upright looms, the finishing and cutting and sewing of clothing, was not background activity performed while other things happened. It was primary productive labor that generated the clothing, the blankets, the sail material for ships, and the trading goods that constituted a significant portion of the Norse household's economic output. The sail of a Viking longship required an enormous quantity of woven cloth. Estimates suggest a single sailing cloth might represent 3 years of a skilled weaver's work, and that cloth was produced in households by women through the same kind of patient daily incremental labor that built the longhouse and filled the storage barrels. The Norse textile tradition produced work of considerable quality. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway in the early 20th century, contained textile fragments that archaeologists identified as among the finest examples of early medieval weaving found anywhere in northern Europe. That quality did not emerge from people treating cloth production as a secondary concern. Children in the hidden village were not kept separate from adult work in the way that modern childhood, structured around schooling and age-appropriate activity, tends to separate young people from the productive labor of the community. Norse children began contributing to household tasks at ages that would now be considered far too young for meaningful work. But the tasks they were given were real tasks with real consequences, and the learning that happened through those tasks was the primary mechanism by which essential knowledge was transmitted across generations. A girl of 8 or 9 was spinning alongside her mother and grandmother, making real thread that would go into real cloth, making real mistakes with real consequences that corrected her technique faster than any abstract instruction could. A boy of similar age was already involved in the care of animals, already learning to read the behavior of livestock in ways that would tell him whether they were healthy or sick, already developing the physical skills of chopping wood and hauling water that were foundational to adult male labor. The hidden village was not a place where children were educated about life in preparation for eventually participating in it. It was a place where children participated in life from the earliest age their capabilities allowed, and the education was the participation. The social organization of the village operated on principles that combined strong family loyalty with an understanding of mutual dependence that extended beyond family lines. The Thing system, the assembly through which Norse communities made collective decisions, had its analogue at the village level in the regular gatherings where disputes were aired, resources were allocated, and the direction of collective projects was determined. A family that refused to contribute labor to the shared tasks, the repair of the fish weir in the stream, the maintenance of the paths that connected the village to its outlying resources, the communal work of the autumn harvest, was a family that could not expect assistance when its own needs exceeded its own capacity. The reciprocity was explicit and tracked. People knew who had contributed and who had not. Social memory in a small community without writing is extraordinarily precise about these matters, because the stakes of getting it wrong, of extending trust to those who would not reciprocate, were too high to allow casual inattention. The ritual life of the village intersected with the practical in ways that are difficult to disentangle cleanly, because the Norse understanding of the world did not draw a sharp boundary between the natural and the supernatural in the way that later Christian Europe would insist upon. The blessings requested of the Norse gods were not petitions sent to distant figures in a remote domain of the sacred. They were requests addressed to powers understood to be actively present in and through the natural world, in the weather, in the behavior of animals, in the productivity of the land and sea. When a Norse household made an offering before the autumn slaughter, the action was simultaneously religious and practical. It expressed gratitude for what had been received and requested continued favor for what lay ahead. But it also structured the emotional relationship between the community and the life and death stakes of the winter ahead in a way that managed anxiety and reinforced collective purpose. The distinction between prayer and psychological preparation dissolves when you look at it closely enough, something we're curious about. Have you ever tried any kind of historical cooking? Flatbread on a stone, food cooked over open fire, anything preserved without refrigeration? Tell us in the comments. Not looking for expertise, just genuinely interested in whether people experiment with this stuff or whether it stays in the realm of watching. The medical knowledge of the hidden village was embedded in the same practical tradition as every other knowledge domain. Accumulated empirically, transmitted personally, expressed in the work of specific individuals within the community whose understanding of plant medicine and wound treatment and the management of illness had been developed through direct experience and learning from those who had more experience. The Norse medical tradition was not the sophisticated, systematized medicine of Islamic Spain or Byzantine Constantinople, but it was also not the helpless superstition that later Christian accounts sometimes suggested. Archaeological evidence from Norse burial sites shows healed fractures, bones that broke and were set well enough to heal in alignment, and trauma wounds that were treated effectively enough that the person survived for years afterward. The women of the village were the primary practitioners of this medicine, which was considered part of the same domain of household management that encompassed food preparation and textile production. The herb garden cultivated beside the longhouse was a medical resource as well as a culinary one. Yarrow for wound treatment, willow bark for fever reduction, valerian for sleep disturbance, a pharmacopoeia assembled from local knowledge of what the landscape provided. The relationship between the hidden village and the wider world of Norse trade and politics was maintained through carefully managed contact rather than isolation. Complete isolation was not the Norse way. Trade was too central to Norse culture and economy for any settlement to sustain it indefinitely without external exchange. What the village managed was selective contact. The people who left to trade, to fish in coastal waters, to attend regional assemblies, knew how to discuss their home community in ways that conveyed belonging to a broader Norse world without revealing the specific location of the settlement. This kind of managed ambiguity was a social skill developed through practice, and the Norse capacity for it reflected a sophisticated understanding of information as a resource to be controlled rather than freely shared. The men who went out into the wider world and returned brought with them not only trade goods, but information. The political state of the region, the movements of potential threats, news of disputes in other communities that might or might not affect their own, intelligence about trade opportunities that might be worth pursuing in the coming season. This information was shared in the longhouse in the evenings, becoming part of the collective knowledge base that informed village decisions. The picture of the wider world maintained by a Norse community in this way was detailed, regularly updated, and continuously interpreted through the framework of how it affected the community's immediate interests. It was, in short, exactly what intelligence analysis looks like when it's organized around the genuine needs of a community rather than the institutional priorities of a state. The sounds of the village at different times of day were as distinctive as its visual character, and they constituted a kind of auditory map that told those who knew how to read it exactly what was happening and whether it was normal. The morning sounds, the stir of animals in the adjacent shelter, the crackling of the hearth being built up from its banked overnight state, the scrape of a wooden vessel being moved across a stone floor, the first words exchanged between the early risers before the house had fully warmed. The midday sounds of winter, the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood somewhere outside, the high-pitched squeal of a wooden loom pin being adjusted under tension, the low domestic murmur of conversation inside the longhouse, punctuated by the particular soft percussion of a drop spindle reaching the end of its rotation and being wound. The evening sounds, the storytelling voice of an elder, a different vocal register from conversation, slower, more deliberate, with the cadences that marked formal narrative, and beneath it, the attentive quiet of an audience that was simultaneously listening and working with their hands. Storytelling in the Norse tradition was not entertainment in the modern sense of a passive experience consumed by an audience with no other role. It was the primary medium through which history, lore, genealogy, cosmology, and cultural values were transmitted in a society that used writing sparingly and reserved it primarily for brief inscriptions rather than extended prose. The skald, the skilled poetic narrator, held a social position that reflected this centrality. A person who could recite the genealogies of ruling families, who could compose and perform verse that recorded events in a form memorable enough to survive without written support, who carried in memory the legal precedents and mythological frameworks that structured Norse understanding of the world, was a person of genuine and recognized value to any community that harbored them. The hidden village might not have had a full professional skald, but it certainly had people who were better at this than others, and on winter evenings when the fire was adequate and the day's physical labor was complete, those people performed a function that was simultaneously cultural preservation, community building, and the transmission of knowledge that had no other vehicle. Before we close this out, if this video gave you something, a new angle on how these people actually lived, a piece of history you hadn't thought about before, share it somewhere. Text it to someone. Post it. The way this kind of content finds new people is almost entirely through that kind of personal recommendation, and it makes a genuine difference to whether we can keep making videos at this level. We appreciate everyone who does it. The end of winter in the hidden village was not a dramatic moment of liberation. It was a gradual shift in the balance of pressures, the cold still present, but incrementally less absolute, the light returning in increments that were felt before they were measurable. the first signs in the behavior of animals and the state of the earth that the long internal season was beginning to close. The stored food was at its lowest point. The preserved fish and meat that had seemed abundant in October were now carefully rationed, the barrels scraped, every portion accounted for. The psychological weight of months of cold and darkness and confined indoor life was real, and the Norse did not pretend otherwise. The winter depression that modern Scandinavians acknowledge as a genuine seasonal condition was not invented by contemporary psychology. But the response to it was not passive endurance. It was active management through social structure, through the ritual calendar that provided occasions for community gathering and celebration, through the craft work that gave purpose to indoor hours, through the storytelling that placed the current moment within a larger narrative in which winter always ended and the world always renewed itself. The first green growth appeared in places that the community knew to watch: south-facing slopes where the soil warmed first, stream banks where the running water kept frost from penetrating as deeply, clearings in the forest where sunlight reached the ground at an angle that promoted early thaw. These locations were not stumbled upon by chance. They were known, mapped in the community's memory, visited early in the season as a matter of routine by those whose job it was to assess the state of the available foraging landscape. The first edible plants, the young shoots of nettles, the leaves of wood sorrel, the early growth of various herbs, were gathered with an urgency that reflected their nutritional significance after months of dependence on preserved animal proteins and dried plant foods. Fresh green food in early spring provided vitamins and trace elements that the preserved winter diet could not supply, and the Norse recognition of this, expressed not in nutritional language, but in the simple observed fact that people felt better after eating fresh green food after a long winter, was one more example of empirical knowledge achieving accurate results through means other than formal science. The hidden village, as spring arrived and the pressures of survival eased their grip, became a different kind of place, not less purposeful, but purposeful in different ways. The planning and preparation for the next winter began almost immediately, because the Norse relationship with time was not the modern assumption of an indefinitely extending future in which provisions could always be arranged later. It was the understanding, written into the culture through generations of experience, that the only reliable resource was the work done now, in the present abundance of warmth and growth and productivity, which would determine whether the community survived the next period of scarcity. The hidden village endured not because it was hidden, though concealment helped. It endured because the people within it understood with total clarity the relationship between present effort and future survival, and they organized their collective life accordingly, year after year, in the specific geography of their chosen valley, with the specific knowledge accumulated in that specific place, generation after generation, until the knowledge itself became as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the trees and the frozen stream that led the way home. The tools that made the village function were not purchased. They were made, maintained, repaired, and when they had reached the end of their useful life in one form, remade into something else. The Norse relationship with material objects was fundamentally different from the modern consumer relationship in ways that went beyond the obvious absence of manufacturing infrastructure. A tool that was made by hand required a significant investment of labor and knowledge from the person who made it, and that investment created a relationship between the object and its maker, or its inheritor, if the tool had been passed down, that was qualitatively different from the relationship between a person and an object they had simply acquired. The iron knife that a Norse adult carried and used daily might have been made by a smith in a neighboring settlement years or decades earlier, traded for something of equivalent value, carried through seasons of use with regular resharpening, and eventually bequeathed to the next generation with the expectation that it would continue to be used and maintained. The concept of disposability, of objects designed to be used briefly and discarded, was as alien to the Norse material culture as the concept of a fixed working schedule determined by an external institution. The smith occupied a position of particular prestige in Norse communities that reflected the genuine difficulty and importance of iron production and smithing. Iron in the Norse world was produced from bog iron ore deposited by natural processes in the bogs and wetlands that were widespread in Scandinavia, through a smelting process that required precise control of temperature and airflow to reduce the iron oxide to metallic iron. Getting this wrong produced useless slag. Getting it right produced iron blooms that could be worked into tools and weapons through extended hammering at controlled temperatures. The technical knowledge required to smelt iron reliably was not widely held, and communities that lacked a competent smith were dependent on trading relationships with those that had one. Within the village, the smith's workshop, usually a separate structure from the longhouse because the fire hazard of a smithing forge was too significant to risk in proximity to the primary dwelling, was a place of constant activity in the warmer months when conditions for outdoor work were most practical, producing and repairing the iron components of tools and equipment that made every other productive activity possible. An axe with a cracked eye, a cooking pot with a broken handle mount, a harness fitting bent out of shape, these were problems brought to the smith and solved through the application of knowledge that most community members respected and relied upon without possessing themselves. Woodworking was more widely distributed in its technical knowledge, though it too had its specialists. The construction and repair of the longhouse, the building of boats and sledges, the production of the wooden vessels and furniture that constituted most of the household material culture, all of this required a deep practical knowledge of wood as a material, which species were best suited for which applications, how to split wood along its grain for maximum strength, how to work green wood that had not yet seasoned versus dry wood, how to join pieces without metal fasteners using the wooden joinery techniques that Norse construction had developed over generations. A Norse longhouse was not a primitive structure. It was a sophisticated engineering achievement executed in timber by people who understood the material they were working with at a level that modern professional carpenters often express admiration for when they study the archaeological evidence. The water supply of the hidden village was a matter of engineering as much as natural provision. A stream or spring in the right location relative to the settlement was a fundamental requirement. Communities could not be sustained without reliable fresh water access. But the management of that water source required attention and infrastructure. In winter, water access meant maintaining a hole in the ice of the frozen stream, which required daily chopping to prevent the hole from sealing over, and the physical labor of hauling water from the stream to the longhouse in wooden pails. In spring, snowmelt could turn a reliable stream into a flooding hazard that threatened storage structures and paths. The Norse management of their water relationship was continuous and practical, embedded in the daily work rhythm rather than addressed episodically when problems arose. The night in the hidden village deserves attention because it occupied a much larger proportion of lived experience in the Norse world than it does in contemporary life, and the Norse relationship with darkness was correspondingly more developed. Oil lamps, flat stone dishes or clay vessels filled with animal fat and equipped with a twisted moss or wool wick produced light of remarkable efficiency per unit of fuel, but at an intensity that modern eyes calibrated to electric light would find extremely dim. The Norse worked and socialized and told stories in lamplight that cast dramatic shadows and left the upper reaches of the longhouse in near total darkness. and they managed their vision in this light with the same practiced competence they applied to every other environmental challenge. The darkness above was not threatening. It was the smoke-filled upper zone of the longhouse where the preserved foods hung, a space understood and accounted for. The darkness outside the longhouse was a different matter. The Norse night was genuinely dark, in the way that very few places in the modern world are dark, and moving through it safely required either waiting for your eyes to adjust fully to starlight and moonlight or carrying a torch, which presented its own management challenges in a world where fire was both essential and dangerous. The psychological interior of life in the hidden village, the emotional texture of daily existence in a community whose members spent most of the winter in close physical proximity, in a dimly lit, smoky space, is something that the physical and archaeological record gives us only glimpses of, and those glimpses suggest a richness that the bleakness of the conditions might seem to preclude. The Norse were not grim. The sagas, which preserve in literary form something of the emotional register of the culture, are full of dry humor, of elaborate social performance, of competitive verbal wit, and the pleasure of a well-turned insult or a well-constructed argument. The Norse longhouse in winter was not a place where people endured the cold in miserable silence. It was a place where people were, within the constraints of their situation, alive to their relationships, to the stories being told, to the quality of the food being prepared, to the sound of wind against the roof and the particular comfort of being inside with fire and company when the darkness outside was absolute and the temperature had dropped below the point where moisture in the air frosted on exposed skin within minutes. That quality of being alive, present and engaged and socially connected within a very specific, very demanding physical environment is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the hidden village and the people who lived in it. They were not waiting for something better. They were not enduring their lives in anticipation of conditions that would make genuine living possible. They were living fully and completely in the specific world that the specific geography and season and moment had created for them. The complexity of what they had built, the food systems, the social structures, the material culture, the knowledge traditions, the ritual frameworks, was not a complicated workaround for the absence of modern convenience. It was the expression of a complete and coherent relationship with the world as they found it.